All right, good evening. Thank you for your patience. Perhaps it is the very warm Arizona-like weather that has kept people coming late to the lecture, but thank you for coming. We have some really wonderful material to discuss tonight, and I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in a few minutes. But thank you very much for participating in this effort. On behalf of the College of Architecture and Design here at Lawrence Tech, I'd like to welcome you to our Art of Making conversation. This is part of a larger programming effort surrounding the work of Jim Miller Melberg. You've probably looked in our gallery across the hall. And we also have an exhibition down at our Detroit Center on Woodward and Willis. So if you haven't seen that, I definitely recommend it because the two go quite wonderfully together. So using the work of Jim Miller Melberg, what I would like to do today, what we're going to do today, is look at the idea of making and the creative process from a variety of different standpoints. My name's Deirdre Hennebury. I make all sorts of things, usually trouble, but I'm an architectural historian here in the college. And I also am the chair of the exhibitions committee. So it's in that capacity that I am really here tonight. Oh, thank you. And I would like to thank a few people very quickly. First of all, our DCDT team. We have Chris Stefani and Amara Hoja here. Thank you. And we also have a number of other people. But first, I'd like to thank Jim Miller Melberg. He's not able to join us tonight, but for so generously allowing us to use his work in these shows, to have us move through his home and studio, and to really be in that personal space of creation that, for me at least, was really sort of life-altering experience to have that opportunity to go and see his work. I also want to thank Andrea Rosenfeld from the Detroit Art and Business Institute. She connected us with Mr. Miller Melberg. An additional thanks to a variety of people, including my exhibitions team here. I don't see any of them right now, but people like Dave Bogart, Jim Robb, Brent, Bob Vigiletti, who all contributed to our exhibitions in some way, and also to photographer Manzi Yang for her work in documenting the home and studio. So, and finally to our dean, Carl Daubman, for his support of exhibitions here in the college. So thank you to all of those people for making this possible. I just want to say a few words about Jim Miller Melberg. And so the way that I'm going to structure the evening, I'm going to say a few things about him, show you a few images of his home and studio, and then we'll get some of these panelists up here and hear some of their perspectives on the making and creative process. So Jim Miller Melberg was born in 1929. His father was a pattern maker for some of the automotive companies, so he grew up in that messy world of making all sorts of things. While he did take courses at a variety of local institutions, including the University of Michigan, Wayne State, Cranbrook Academy of Art, he never actually formalized a degree. He went to Europe, he studied there with a variety of different sculptors, and as he said, sort of just kind of lapped this all up, absorbed all of these experiences. These were the inspirations that would inform all of his later work. In 1961, he formed Form Inc. And you can see here, these are some of the playground pieces for his playscapes. And this is a business that he would actually run and make objects for the next 20 years. And it was sold in the early 80s. Following his success with the playscape designs, he continued to explore sculpture and design in a lot of different media. What I'm showing you here, you can see just bits and pieces of things. He had clay, plaster, bronze casting. He tried different casting strategies through his career. He also moved from very large scale to very small scale works. And through his career, we also see a move from sculpture to more two-dimensional works. And that's something that we've tried to sort of showcase in our exhibitions. So the move from a large-scale piece to maybe a more relief work on the wall. last spring, when we were invited to consider an exhibition for the Detroit Design Festival, I was asked to come and see the Miller home and studio. Wow, of course, I'd love to see an artist's home and studio. And what a gift. So quickly, very quickly, because I could go on, in the next few slides, I just want to show you some images that were taken by Manzi Yang of the Melberg home and studio to give you a sense of how really art and creation infuse all aspects. This is what greeted me on entering. Pieces made over sort of the stretch of his career. On the end there you can see that's actually not a finished piece, it's a study done in foam. And these maquette models, these study models, where he would test things out at different scales and at different materials before finally making a large-scale object, a large-scale sculpture, was something that I found really compelling about the space. The home is just full of art. And you've seen some of these pieces in our gallery. We've tried to bring some of that sort of autobiographical quality into our own spaces. This is one of my favorite pieces, just because in a day, perhaps I'm showing my age, but we always stuck everything up. It wasn't all on the computer screen. And when a studio critic would come over for a desk crit, they were half looking to see what I was thinking about and looking about, as well as what I might have been drafting the previous night. So these kind of inspiration boards, again, a lens into that creative process. In Jim Miller Melberg's studio, which is at the rear of his property, again, we can see some finished works mixed with just this fantastic melange, I'll call it, of the creative process. And when I first saw this, we have to have an exhibition about making. There's no way we can't. And I would have just shown all of these. I'm like, some of them are too fragile to move, but all of those different models, some made very quickly, some very deliberately, maybe 4 or 5 iterations of the same piece with slight differences. To me, that is why I thought it was important for our students here and for everyone who's interested in that process to see. Oh, sorry. And then just one last slide here. These were my first impressions of his work. And I guess what stuck with me were this idea of experimentation, that you should experiment. The iteration, the iterative work, trying things over and over again, and ultimately really this focus on the idea of making. And so I knew we had to do a show here. And with these themes in mind, and some of these images, I'd like to introduce some of our guests. So if I can get the slide to advance. Our first 2 panelists that I'd like to say a few things about their work are Jen McGray, and she's a registered architect and associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And her co-founder, so I'll introduce them both, is Maria Arquero de Alarcon, and she is an associate professor of architecture and urban and regional planning, as well as the director of urban design at the University of Michigan. And together, they founded MADE Studio. And this is a research-based firm focused on the development of environmentally and culturally sound architecture and urban design practices. And just from my sort of foray into their works recently, I certainly can see that their work covers the fields of architecture, urbanism, and certainly landscape, and particularly the idea of playscape is quite wonderfully represented there. So Jen and Maria, would you like to come up and say a few words? I've been reminded to ask you to use the mics. And this just forward and backward.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, perfect. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us. We're just going to share with you one glimpse at one small project, which we think represents maybe some of the most fun making we've done recently. And this is a project that we did for a playground in Battle Creek, Michigan, a couple of years ago now. But more generally speaking, I think it also represents how the small things we do manifest some of our regional or urban ambitions, in this case related to play. The line images that you see on your right are literally the diagrams of figuring out this particular playscape, but they, more broadly speaking, are us asking the question of, can we flip the way that we use lines from being boundaries to being something that stitches the city and play spaces back together again? And then the image on the left were the collaborators that we were working with on this project, not unlike the spirit of Melberg's sculptures, where he was seeking out fabricators, in his case, a septic fabrication company, to do some of his tubular structures. These folks typically do bending for subway rails and handrails in bathrooms, and were game for taking on a playground along with us, and it was a really fun collaboration. And then a few images of where that went. It is a daycare in Battle Creek, and its ambition educationally was to provide daycare and a play space for kids that were being subsidized to access these things. So the budget was pretty small, which I think in the end worked to our advantage, because we basically tried to boil down all of the play elements to the single line that could set up some of the relationships and some of the spaces in a broader garden, along with some garden spaces. And a little shade structure, which you see behind her. It was fall moving into winter, so the shade cloth is not on it, because we wanted sunshine more than shade at this moment. But ultimately, this was a way of navigating some of the strict play regulations that happen right now by removing all of the moving parts and all of the nuts and bolts, literally, of a project, and just trying to be as simple and direct as possible as a way of making, allowing the children to navigate this landscape of play.
Thank you. So our next panelist is Carl Daubman, and he is the Dean of our College of Architecture and Design here at Lawrence Tech. He is a registered architect, and he has a record of distinguished projects, inspired and driven by his interest in the intersections between design, technology, and also multidisciplinary design. Daubman began the Daub Research Studio in 2012 as a way to kind of focus some of those research interests, and as he said, those preoccupations. And he is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. So Carl, would you like to? Whoops.
So I included 3 short, simple projects. The first was done in Rome, and it was a project for, I was looking at Borromini, a Baroque architect, and started a collaboration with the kitchen at the American Academy. And so started designing pasta shapes and building, or designing and making a pasta press as part of this. In terms of the making, for me, it was interesting to work in even just getting access to the kitchen. I think in the same way that you talked about accessing that studio space, how do you enter a space like that? How do you get into that space? And so starting to spend more and more time in the kitchen and starting to learn about the dough and the ingredients and the materials and how much it can stretch and what are the structural properties of that. So working in that way in a very small scale. Another project that I think highlighted making was one of looking at fabric forming plaster, as looking at them as architectural models, and in this case also using a small robotic work cell as a way to hold those fabric pieces in place as the plaster was being cast. And this was a project that we kind of always knew what we were doing, but we never knew what we were really going to get until we pulled the plaster out of the fabric pieces. We could replicate it after we had done it, but there was always an element of surprise. I think in the same way that maybe a photographer, when you take a picture and then you develop the film and then you actually print it, there's a certain amount of discovery that happens with that. And I think this was another project about that the the making was an aspect of the discovery and the research. And then the last project was a project that started with a material and a detail. And so it was just simply looking at a sheet of aluminum and how you would laser cut specific shapes out of that. And so this project is a small temporary pavilion that was made of really, really thin sheet metal that was all laser cut, trying to minimize the waste of a sheet and how those parts go together and how it gets built. And I said it was a temporary pavilion. It was aluminum sheet and aluminum rivets, and the removal of the piece at the end was paid for itself by its recycling. So it completely went away and was recycled.
Our next panelists are Eric and Israel Norton. Here they come. Working together and creating objects in Detroit for the last 20 years, the Norton brothers create what they refer to as statement pieces. Pieces, then works that tell stories. And they describe themselves as, quote, artists who create objects for spaces, unquote. They specialize in using glass, metal, wood, and other mediums to create fine art, but also functional objects. They founded the Detroit Design Center. This is located at 6100 Michigan Avenue in Detroit. This is where they make their work, and actually there's an image in a few slides. It's a 12,000 square foot space with 2 cranes, so lots of space for making, and probably some breaking as well. The brothers are 2 of the founding fathers of the Detroit Design Festival. And they're also the original creators of the Detroit menorah, one of the largest in the country. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're crafters kind of from the start. When we were growing up, we were always building stuff around the house. We had a little wood shop in the basement. Our grandpa was a tool and die maker, so we knew the the allure of making things yourself. And it's like the idea that everything that you want isn't necessarily out there. Sometimes you might have to make it. So we kind of grew up with that mentality in our head. What she was saying about our studio space, we had we grew up with our father's steel business, and he basically expanded the business when he knew that we were going to be in arts and music and stuff like that, because him and mom talked and they said, well, we've pushed these guys to find what they love to do. That was a big important thing, is they always taught us that whatever you're going to do, make sure you love it more than everybody else. Because if you're playing a game, or you're in a contest, or you're in school, in a department with somebody who loves to do it more than you, you're probably going to lose. So you better make sure you find something that you love better than everybody else, and then you're going to win. So when you're finding things out there, make sure that you have that love and that passion, because it really is the most important part of your life, is just finding that thing that you love and you're going to be good at. And so our mom and dad, they expanded their company to give us a place where we could work. Now, it was cutting heavy steel, and it was loud, and it cutting ourselves, but what that did was it made us want to do our craft and after work was over. So, we had that job all through school, and then we were also getting our businesses started on the side. And, Dad would always come down and look at what we were doing, and we were scared to tell him we had gotten any jobs, because if we did, he'd raise our rent. And he'd come down and measure where we were working, and he'd, let me see the tape, son. He'd be like, I forgot to put my stuff away. And he'd measure, another 12 square feet, and here comes your new rent. So it was always very common practice, like how would we treat it out there in the real world. But that taught us that ethic, and having a place to work now, it's a wonderful blessing. He eventually retired, and we bought the building from him, we love making. Eric?
So just to speak quickly on the slides that we put up here, I don't know if I'm coming to the microphone or not, but we started off just making things, things that would pay the bills, and we worked a lot with restaurants and architects and clubs and kind of morphed from there into making things for people's homes, designing furniture. Got pretty creative when the economy collapsed here 10 years ago in Detroit. There wasn't a lot going on art-wise, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity, but stuck it out here and started our focus on making public art around that time, you know, coming up with concepts. And so I would say in the last 10 years, we've been working on more public pieces. And what you see behind you here is a piece we just finished for Grosse Pointe Park. It's about a 20-foot piece, and they originally approached us to do something that was inspired by sailing, and we kind of shaped the piece to be more about two sails, which was Detroit and Grosse Pointe working together. So that was the inspiration of this piece, trying to keep things moving. This piece here is a piece of Sinai Grace Hospital in Detroit, and as Dieter said, our pieces tell a story. Each of our pieces has a story that we find connects, you know, when somebody sees something and they understand what it means and why it is, typically they just enjoy it more. And there was 3 entities in the hospital, with Sinai and Grace were the 2 hospitals that were kind of taking over Mount Carmel, and DMC bought them, and this particular tree sculpture, which the center tree is about 18 feet tall, abstract versions of trees for guys who make things out of steel and glass. But it's a nice centerpiece for the hospital. And one of the fun elements of this piece is we put nests in them with small glass-blown eggs that kind of speak of maternity wards. And it makes a fun element for people coming to a place like a hospital that's not necessarily fun, brings a little joy to their lives.
And like Eric was saying, in the beginning, we had to find work because we did some art fairs and stuff like that, but it wasn't really our cup of tea to have people coming in and kind of judging what we were doing. And it's like, oh, I have one of those. It's beautiful. And it's like, no, I don't think you do have one of those. You're just saying that, you know, get out of here. You know, so we'd kick them out of our booth, and we realized that that wasn't really the venue for us. So what we really started to do is just when you're going around town, you meet people and you figure out what they're about, what they're doing, and you can find needs. So what we would do is when we met people, when we seen their environment, we would discover needs that they had. And that was kind of our hustle. As we'd be like, oh man, you need that over there. And what are you talking about? I've never seen that before. And then, you know, that's where our design came in, because we'd be like, well, of course you've never seen it. You know, this is something that we're creating right now. And we would find a need, you know, and where art is an elective, you know, the things that we were doing, we were really solving people's problems. You know, it's like, I bought this place and I don't know what the hell I'm going to do over in that corner over there, because it's just, there's a weird spot and there's nothing out there that the person could find. So they would call us, or we would discover them, and we would design something that fit into that niche, you know what I mean, or basically create a purpose for us. This is another shot where, funny enough, our insurance adjuster tried to drop us because he looked at our website and saw this and was like, Jesus, I can't insure these guys. So they cut our insurance.
Well, what we're doing next year is we're going to put the white-collared pictures of us for that week that we're getting our insurance audit, and then we'll go back to this piece right here. So heads up to you young artists and crafters. Be careful with your insurance with photos like this. As well to the right up here, and then we'll get on to you know, more speak of Jim's work. These are some other public. We did, you know, the top piece is the piece up in Port Huron. The centerpiece this year, we made a piece for U of M, and Jim Harbaugh named it the MVP award for Michigan football. So it'll live in Schembecker Hall now forever, which is an honor because I went to Michigan. If there's any Michigan State people here, I'm sorry, or other. And then the bottom piece is a piece we just put in Corktown next to, real close to Slows, but in the Michigan Avenue kind of center section in front of the train station. And a funny note on that was Mayor Dugan said that it was the first piece that's gone into Detroit sculpture with every department, including the Parks and Rec, approving it in about 10 years. So he was proud that the piece actually was able to follow all protocol instead of being vigilante style. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you. Bob, would you like to come up? Bob Vigiletti is a freelance and fine art photographer. Throughout his career, he's aimed to break down the barriers between fine art and applied art through his work, which encompasses personal, artistic, and also commercial photography. A very partial list of clients includes General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Herman Miller, Motown Records, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the Museum of African American History. Bob's work has also been featured in numerous publications, and he's the author of several catalogs and art volumes. In addition to teaching, Bob founded the photography department at the College for Creative Studies. Bob has exhibited his work extensively since the 1960s, so lots of group and personal shows. We are particularly pleased to have him join us today because one of his early clients was Form Inc., and that is Jim Miller Melberg's Placegate company. So many of the photographs, well, this one included here, the silhouette shot, and then we have a bunch of his beautiful black and white photographs at the DCDT exhibition were in fact taken by Bob. So thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Deirdre. Yeah, I guess I'm the senior member here. I know I don't look it, but next week I'll be 87 years old. And I've lived through the era of transition, and I was asked to talk about that. I've brought up with traditional design and photography. Actually, my major at Wayne State University way back in the 50s was industrial design with a minor in photography. And I did work as a designer for a couple of years after school, and then kind of, because I kind of minored in photography, I gravitated over to photography as a career. My true love is in fine art. I did commercial work. I enjoyed it. I had to make a living. And I was asked how the new technology affected me. Well, I've always welcomed the new technology. For me, and I profess to my students that the new technology just opened more doors for creative thinking and production. Some people like to stick to the tradition, but I always found it exciting to discover new avenues of creativity, new exciting ways of doing things. Anyhow, oh, here's my clicker. Top one here. I think it's just okay. All right. I've done a lot of commercial work in a variety of fields. Some fashion, a lot of advertising, product, some editorial for magazines like the Potters and so forth. I worked for GM Photographic for a few years full-time, and then when I had an opportunity to create a photography department and major at the College for Creative Study back in 1963, and gave me the opportunity to design the curriculum and the physical facility. And I worked with the architect. He actually gave me free rein to design the physical facility over there, William Kessler. And for GM, after I left, I guess they liked what I did there. They asked me if I would work on a freelance basis after I left them and went into teaching, and I should have my summers free and so forth. So I said, yeah, I would. That'd be fine. And some of these pictures that you see up there of the cars, let's see, some were taken in the studio, and the middle one, they sent me on an assignment for like a month in Arizona. They give me a whole list of photographs, or cars to photograph. And it was fun because I was on my own. I'd go out in the morning and I'd get the cars, some required models, and I'd photograph all day in 110 temperature. It was the last 2 weeks in July and the first 2 weeks in August that I did that assignment. But I had free reign, which I liked, and those two top pictures are no, the middle picture is from Arizona. The other two are studio shots where you had to learn how to light a car and so forth. I did posters for Habitat Gallery. My wife is a glass blower, or was. She's retired now. She was in on the initial movement of studio glass art, and she's more famous than I am. She's got work in museums locally in Germany and Denmark and the Smithsonian and so forth. She's also retired, but she's a great creative influence on me too. I gravitated, when I retired in 1996, to dedicating my time to my own personal work, which is abstract fine art. And I got the idea of photographing elements that I found and that I could possibly manipulate into abstract compositions like the one at the top, and I manipulated them greatly in Photoshop. I could collage them, change color, do about anything at all I wanted to. And then my latest thing that I wanted to experiment with is I wondered if I could take some of these two-dimensional abstract images and actually create three-dimensional sculptures. So I started experimenting with that. What you see below on the bottom picture is not derived from the top one, but I've done about maybe 10 or 12 different experiments now with different two-dimensional art and changing them into three-dimension, which are printed on metal and using the idea of origami, creating sculptural objects. I've done some in Photoshop, simulated into environments where I hope all these are just one of many shots that people would get excited about it and commission me to do a big one. These would be ideally 8, 10, maybe even 12 feet tall, printed on metal and constructed and hopefully one day I might get a commission to do one, a big one. So, thank you.
Thank you. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to sit here and ask a few questions of our panelists. And I encourage you all, if you have questions, we'll open it up as well. So be sure, think of some right now. And here are names just in case you want to direct your question to a particular party. Oh, you guys are switched around. That's okay.
I'll figure it out.
So my first question is for the teams here, so for our collaborators, because it seems, and in many ways, all of you have collaborated with manufacturers, with clients. Certainly there's lots of collaboration. But in the case of Eric and Israel and Jen and Maria, you're working together on these projects. And I'm wondering, I guess my question is, can that enliven, the making process, can it also sometimes be a detriment? Can you think of examples where, of both, maybe? That would be great. So with Jen and Maria, would you like?
I can start a little bit on that. Well, collaboration is fun, but it's also messy, and it requires, in many cases, in a lot of the work that we do, we not only work together, we work with many other people, and we are very intentional in this working with, which means that at times you need to also release a little bit the sense of authorship, and how you are actually negotiating your own interests and your own personal take on the exploration that you are doing, and how did you gain feedback and how you also respond to that. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest lessons since we started working together, not only learning to work together and to pass the, ambitions and frustrations at times, but actually bring the work together with our partners on the ground and be able to get everybody excited and have the energy to go back and forth an endless number of times. And that happens with both the work that we are doing in smaller scales that we treasure a lot, working with local partners that otherwise may not be able to afford design. But it also happens with colleagues at the research level, in which, you know, we are continuously trying to make the case for why design and, you know, why making and why visualizing things and creating a culture of, I don't know, seeing matters a lot for the work that we do to really touch the heart of other people. So that's something important that is not only about our own method of working, it's actually about how we engage with others. And then in terms of our own way of working, when things get better and when things get complicated, I think there are, you know, moments of that in every single project, moments in which, you know, things work well. I think, I don't know, even by looking at that, you can get a sense of who is really good at colors and who is boring like hell. So this is just one example. I think, you know, it's not only that I trust, it's that I'm fascinated by the way in which Jen will use color and how she plays with geometry. Those are things that, you know, I'm like, oh my God, it's just fascinating. Also, the way in which she uses technology that is not so familiar for me and the work that, you know, I was doing before, and how that allows the work to be really fun and sparkly and, you know, and process-based. And I think in those cases, it's just a gift to be able to have a partner, you know, that. And then there are other moments in which, you know, we may have a different opinion about things, and then things go back and forth a fair amount of times. And, you know, that's also, I would say, an important part of the process, because when we bring the work outside and we, you know, we share that, we want to make sure that both our personalities are in there. So I don't know. I'm not being very specific, but
Maria covered a lot. She's being too modest about her participation in the collaboration. You can certainly feel Maria's spirit in the room, and it's part of the work that we do. And very much like our collaborators on this discussion panel, I think everybody mentioned how sometimes just having joy in making the thing and then bringing that idea to the table in front of others is enough to get everybody else excited about it too, and that's certainly a really important part of the practice and a really important part of making. Mm-hmm. We do make drawings, we make models, we make lots of different things, but the models and the items that are more tangible and messy in the sense that you can really see maybe the process and the working through of ideas are the ones that really get conversations going the best. And that's something that, in reverse, we've struggled with. I don't know about from the point of view of photography, but sometimes when drawings look too real, it closes down the possibility for imagination, to imagine that that could be different through conversation. And I think that's where the abstractions and the kind of working in progress and process is absolutely critical for collaboration to be to yield something that means that the outcome is better than any individual could have done on their own.
I guess the one thing that we always say to our clients, since we're working from a collaborating standpoint, is we tell our clients that they're getting something really great because they have two people fighting for the best idea for them. So it's like if you went somewhere and you had a stylist and another stylist that were like working, and they were like, no, she deserves better than that, you know? And it's like the next thing, it's like we literally go to town and battle to come up with the best idea. And it's like that's an asset for our clients, because if you're just one person, you know, creating something, who's really putting it to the test? Is it really being stretched? Is it really being pushed? Are you pushing yourself? Those are a lot of questions, and you can have the answers to that, and you can be doing everything right. But when you're working in a collaborating, you know, environment, it really pushes you to, you know, double, triple check what you're saying, because if you're like, the McDonald's sign is orange, and somebody's like, no, it's not, it's yellow. It's like, you've kind of lost some clout, you know, and it's like the next thing you say, people might not listen to. So it's like when you are in a collaborating situation, it's like you really want to double, triple check what you're saying, because you know darn well the person you're collaborating with, they're going to double, triple check it. And if, you know, if it comes down where you were wrong, then you know you're kind of like putting yourself beneath that person. So, you know, when you are collaborating, you're always trying to stay at the top of your game. And another thing I wanted to say about collaborating is that, you know, necessity is the birth of invention. So what is design other than invention? You know, it's like when you're designing something, you're inventing it. You know, maybe it's a rubber bouncy ball. It's already been made, but you're going to do it differently. Or you're going to be a designer who's going to do the same thing that's been done before. We don't need to talk about those guys. So, you know, when you're doing the new things that are being done, you're inventing something brand new. And in that respect, if you're coming up with the idea, if there are collaborators around who didn't come up with that idea, you have to consider how much you know, impact they have on the piece. You know, so we really always try to consider where the idea is coming from, you know, and you know, not close anybody out, but if there's somebody who's been introduced, like a city council member, you know what I mean, who likes butterflies, it's like you really have to fact check and go back to where this idea came from in conception and see if the butterflies apply. Because, you know, when you're inventing something, you can let a whole bunch of people distract you and take you away from that thing that was really awesome that you wanted to do, or you can let a bunch of people help you get to that point. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that it can be distracting to have collaborators involved if they don't have a full understanding of where you're trying to go with your ideas. But if you have somebody who is sympathetic and empathetic to what you want to do, and they're right there too, and they're like, oh yeah, we got to do that because of this. If they're there, right there with you, then it can be a wonderful brainstorming session, you know what I mean, where you just come up with a bunch of ideas. But if that person isn't in the same kind of stake as you are, then, you know what I mean, sometimes you have to separate yourself, you know, from it and try, kind of just be more pure with the idea. But there's a lot of different ways to do it.
So as you can tell, as brothers, we get that question asked often, was what it's like collaborating with your brother. And we have a saying that when the other person doesn't give you the answer that you want, it was, who asked you anyways, right? But one of the best things about collaborating with somebody that you trust, and family is great that way, is they say it the way it is, they say the truth. And when you're collaborating with any person, that's, you know, it's really important to have that relationship with a collaborator that you both have the same goal and you both have the same vision. You might get to that vision in a different way, but it really brings in other ways of thinking about things that maybe you didn't, which would lead me to my second point, which is with both collaborators and clients, the most important thing you can do is listen. You know, sometimes we get an idea in our head and we're going in a direction and somebody says, have you ever gone this way? And you go, oh, no, I'm going this way. But if you stop for a minute and you listen to what that person's saying and you give it a second, you know, you might learn a new way of getting somewhere. And touching on clients, I can't tell you how many times we've dealt with clients who have said to us they've got something finished and didn't know why it was what it was, because the person that they were working with didn't listen to them. It's like asking for fish and chips at dinner and then the steak arrives and you're like, I didn't ask for fish and chips. So it's really important as a designer, as an architect, or as anybody who's collaborating, a maker, to listen to your clients, because if you don't listen, you're going to end up somewhere that you don't want to be. But collaborating is a joyful thing. I'm a musician as well, and to me it's sort of like anything that you do that brings in another person only adds a level to it. There's difficulties to it, but collaboration is a beautiful thing, and if you don't do it, then I highly suggest you try.
Great, thank you. My next question, actually, any of you could probably answer it, but I'll direct it to Carl, and maybe Bob might want to add. And that has to do with the idea of iteration or testing and repetition. Something that I saw, for example, in the Jim Miller home and studio, where you'd see a sketch, a quick sketch, there'd be 10 of them, and then there'd be some cardboard studies, all of that same form that ultimately is resolved in a series of bronzes. And it was this wonderful sort of trajectory of an idea that's explored in all these different ways. And I asked Carl, because I saw his lecture last year about some of his Borromini explorations, but I wonder for Carl, and then maybe Bob after, about this idea of repetition and of testing and how that figures into your making process.
I mean, it figures in immensely, and I think some of what we were talking about and some of what that was brought up was the technology aspect to it, and so a lot of that has been looking to find ways that to speed that up, or is there a way that you could potentially automate looking at 20 different versions of something really quickly, or the plaster work that I showed, using the robots as a way to speed that up. The other aspect to it, though, with that was really interesting to me is that while we did the work with the plaster, it was really delicate. There was nothing too precious about it, and so like plaster and looking at some of the examples that we saw, sometimes it's the cheapest material or the most readily available material that allows you to test something, and it's okay if it breaks, and you learn something when it breaks. And so it's probably only at that point where you get to working with bronze, or we've been talking to other artists who, like, we only use marble for clients, but we cut this other type of stone when we're testing something. And so I think there's a kind of quick and dirty way in terms of working and testing those things. And then I think it's also how you test them, whether you bring it to put it in its context, in the example that you showed, simulating what that might look like, looking at it in different types of light. The light in the studio is incredible in terms of in the photographs that you showed, how you see it over the course of the year, what it might be, or how it tastes, or putting those things in different contexts and trying to understand if it stands up to what you're proposing.
Can I jump
Yeah,
in?
Absolutely.
Because I want to ask Carl, technology is great because it empowers you to be able to generate many options. But I think in the loss of effort, there is also maybe a way of relaxing intentionality. How do you handle that? So that the production of an endless amount of things is not just for the sake of it, and how, when this moment, the creative moment comes, to be able to be really, truly intentional about, what it is exactly that, because I see this a lot in a studio, for instance. We keep insisting the students that you gotta test ideas, and then there are 20 options, but they don't always know how to talk about precisely what it is that each one of those options is doing in the creative process.
Well, what if the first one is the best one?
Which is sometimes the case. So how do you leverage that? Because I think it has also to do with this, it's technology, but it's craft. It's all the time a conversation, I think, in between old and new ways of making. And yeah, I want to...
Well, and maybe it's more craft. I mean, in the fact that we're talking about making and examples that everyone's used, there's maybe a kind of openness that you bring to that, or there's in terms of the iterative testing, that you actually learn something about what you're doing. I think if you have an idea, and maybe this is like the way that you guys were talking about it in terms of listening, a lot of what I talk about is listening to a material, listening to the technology, listening to the robot, collaborating with the robot. It's like, if I'm, the things that I never like doing is that when I have an image in my head and I make that. That's really like a closed thing right away. But if the thing that you make is something that you're discovering something new, then I think there's a kind of snowball effect. And so I think you have to be open to those things in terms of doing it. If you're just simply producing that thing, then it may be, you make one and you're done. And that's not necessarily making, and I don't think that might be, in terms of craft and in terms of testing those things and in terms of always pushing yourself a little bit further. I think that's that kind of openness that I think is necessary if we're going to talk about making and iteratively testing things as a way of understanding and pushing our ideas.
I think there's a practice to creating things. That when you just create things and they're just like, whatever I make right now, I'm just going to make something. And you make something and you're not really thinking about how you're making it. You're just more like free speaking. You're free making. But I think that when you're going for executing a design, it's all about familiarity, and it's like just being close to that design, and it's like becoming familiar with it, and it's like doing a fun thing that we do sometimes is we'll have an idea and we'll be like, we'll just draw it 20 times. And it's like, you may just get some loose little line, you know what I mean? That 19th time where you're like, damn, that is so much better than the first one. And it's like, then you may do it 20 times again, or you may do it 20 times again. And you can't keep doing that forever, but there is always that thing that, it's a big thing, and it crosses over many different levels. And Eric will say a lot. He'll say, you know, when I'm calling on pricing things, it's always that last guy that I call. When I'm like, shit, I'm going to end. It's 5 o'clock, 3 minutes to 5. Maybe I better call one more. And it's that one more person that you call that gives you the great deal and a nice person. And it's like, that's the one you end up going with. So it never hurts to just try one more, just draw it again, just familiarize yourself with it one more time. We spend so much time, let's run through the install. And it's like, we'll just be running through the install, and then I'll take the Gaga gun, and then I'll put the screw in. And it's like, you just familiarize yourself with what you're doing, and you're going to be more enlightened, and you're going to be more able to make better decisions, because luck favors a prepared mind. So if you're ready for it, luck is out there everywhere.
I have to apologize for my hearing is really getting bad, and I'd like to say something. I hope it's not too far-fetched from the topic, but as far as my attitude and my approach to work, both commercial and personal, in my commercial work, I always try to, of course, please the client, to answer, not necessarily please, to answer their problem in a most creative way that would please me as well. And I know that in one case when I did the one shot you saw of the girl going down the stairway at Cranbrook, it was for a catalog for cosmetics, and the client had the inside theme was all on classical things and on the Roman Empire and Greece and so forth. And when it came to the cover, he said, you know, this product is sold like Avon door to door, and maybe for the cover we should have a person standing in the foyer of the house with a table with the products on it. And I started to get sick to my stomach. And I said, I said, you know, we've got a classical theme going on here. And I said, I have an idea of a girl descending this classic stairway at Cranbrook with this tunic on and holding, maybe she could hold the package that represents your product. And he couldn't understand quite, about that. So I took it upon myself. I knew models that I had worked with before, and said, would you be willing to do a job for me on speculation and see what happens? So she said, yeah. And so we went out to Cranbrook, and my idea was having her descending this classic stairway with this classic gown and so forth. And I put Vaseline on the lens and give it a little more foggy appearance and so forth. You know, and I allowed room on the right for the type and so forth. And I went ahead and made a mock-up of the cover. And when they saw it, he liked it. He said, oh, yeah. And I said, that's so much better. And speaking to the whole flavor of the consumer, why they would buy the product and so forth. And so they bought it, which made me very happy that I convinced them of something better aesthetically than his corny idea, you know. But yeah, I try to answer the need for whatever I'm doing on a commercial assignment. But also try to, as I said, try to satisfy myself. But now that I retired, I said, is it time for me to devote to my own work in my own way? And I don't collaborate too much on my own work. I work with another artist, Lester Johnson, and I collaborate with him on his work. Because he doesn't know the Photoshop or the technology, and he has some ideas, and we work back and forth as far as my contributing to the final product and his contribution to it. So in that way, I think collaboration can work and does work, and other things are quite private.
Just one quick thing that I would add to your, at least the evolution of a piece and trial and error. I think a big factor of that is time. because if you have all the time in the world and you're creating your art or you're creating your piece and you have no boundaries, then you can spend forever working on it. If you're working in a field where you have to have something done on a time limit, then you really need to trust your instinct in a way and make wise decisions. And sometimes you let your children go. By that I mean your work go at a point that you're not quite sure they're ready. But if you have those deadlines, then that really helps formulate a plan for how many times you can experiment with something. You know, I think that really comes down to that sometimes things can get overworked too. And if you don't have somebody there saying to you, hey, it's good enough, it's time to go, we got to ship it, time to ship it, then you can overwork things, you can work things to death. So there's definitely a fine balance, and I think as creators, as you know, all of us are, that you got to find that fine balance, and you got to listen to the voice inside your mind when it's time to go, and trust that it's going to be okay. And that kind of relates to your earlier question, I think, a little.
I have a number of questions, but I'm wondering, are there any questions we have out here? Oh, good. Professor Geyer has a question.
Well, I'm used to this room, so I don't really need the microphone.
Good try.
Okay, does that work?
Yeah.
So this kind of ties into what you were just discussing. I've been fascinated for a long time by creative makers and the idea of knowing when whatever they're making is finished. And it seems like so many of the artists that I've read about or heard talk about, and painters in particular for some reason, but the general attitude they have seems to be that it's never really done, you just give up on it at some point. And so I was curious as to what your attitude towards the end point is. And I know sometimes, you know, you have the deadline and you have to stop at a certain point, but in those cases where maybe you have a little bit more time, how do you know when it's done? How do you know when it's finished? How do you know when to go to another iteration, or if this is the one that you're going to start working with?
Hopefully I'm speaking, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think I could speak for everybody in that you just know when a piece is done. It's like when you're rearranging the furniture in your house, you just, you know, it's like you move on to something else because you could just move the furniture around to oblivion, but it's like, what's the point in that? You know, you just want to get it to an appealing situation, and it's like, I think for a lot of makers, they're going to make again. You know what I mean? It's not like the one piece they're working on is like the end all be all. It's going to be on the front of Time Life cover, and they're never going to have another opportunity to make something again. That would be a horrible situation because there'd be so much stress on making sure it is complete and finished. So I think that a lot of makers are just like, this is, you know, what I'm going for. It isn't screaming at me that it needs more. You know, it's not screaming at me that it's not finished. And I'm pleased with it. And I got another project to work on. You know what I mean? So those are some of the things that make you move on. Because like Eric was saying, if you're a trust fund baby and you got no clients, you might work on the same painting for 30 years. And it's like, you might be happy, and it's really just a hobby. You know, you're not really, you know, it's like effectively trying to complete something. And I think to artists, just like people who make children, it's like you want to make successful children. You want to get them out, you know what I mean, to get the next one. So as artists, that's what we try to do too. It's like we're always just trying to get to the next one, and the one that is in front of us is very important. But it's like when your kid's 18, he doesn't have to be a scholar. He just has to know how to work and, you know, maybe treat his girl right, and you know what I mean? And some of those important things need to be there, but he'll figure out things when he goes out there, and you literally could work on a piece forever if you wanted to, but it's more about just being like, you know, you're kind of exhausted with the love and energy that you're putting into it, where you're just like, so long, next.
Jen, did you want?
Well, real quick too on that, I think collaborating, because that touches on what we were talking about earlier. Collaborating really does help with that decision making, because you could be staring at something for hours, and the other person comes in and either A, gives you that comforting pat on the shoulder and says, it's perfect, right? And then you go, right, it's done. Or they come in and they don't say anything, and they look at it and they're like, and that gives you that kind of, well, maybe we need to work on it a little bit more. So at least for us, and I'm thinking maybe it's kind of that similar way for you guys to have somebody else come in at some point in time. It's not always like that, and it's always not connected to collaboration, but that does help. And to Israel's earlier point too, I think it's a little bit of just gut instinct, right? You know when you've worked it enough, you've looked at it enough, you've manipulated it enough, and it just feels right. And maybe it's like that magic moment you meet somebody that's your partner for the rest of your life. It's just a moment where you go, you feel settled, it's done.
Jen?
Yeah. When you know when you're done, I'm always for asking myself what else and what more, and can I do and experiment and keep going. Well, when the project starts getting worse, then you know you're done. Step back one step and say, that's it, I'm done.
100%.
It's done.
Yeah, I think I maybe can relate to that a little bit more. I love the romantic notion that you know when it's done. For us, it's not that way at all. I think we stop when we are excited about the possibility of something, but I don't think we know for sure. And maybe it has to do in part because something like the play pieces are going to be interacted with, and there's a lot about that you just can't anticipate. You hope that it sparks excitement and enthusiasm and all these things, but you don't know until it's out there for a while, and you just wait and watch and see what happens. And the wonderful thing about that is that in many cases, the joy does come, but it comes in completely different ways than we were imagining, the way that they use, the way they interact. And that's half the point. I mean, one of the things that's maybe the most difficult for us to communicate, because I think when we have a lot of community meetings about playgrounds and things like this, and for the play especially, those meetings can be quite honestly brutal. It's one of the questions is about how do you know, not just when it's done, but how do you know it will work is maybe closer to the kind of question that we get asked. And the line that we showed you was a huge debate. There were a number of people in the room who were really upset about it because they felt that the children weren't going to know exactly what to do. And you know, it's this conversation of how do you know when you're done? For us, we don't, but we know that we'd like to try this. And we have usually partners that are excited about it as well, and we try it, and then we watch, and then we make adjustments that way. So there is an iterative process to get to that point, to put it into the world. But I think there's also an iterative process that happens across your entire practice. And not just with all the playgrounds, but the play line affects the way that we do the next thing that maybe is completely different from that as well. So a lot of the iteration for us, I think, is just, it's a form of knowledge creation, I think. And as designers, I think we're in a pretty interesting position because we balance between explicit forms of knowledge where you can do a structures calculation, or you can figure out the shear loads on a piece of steel or whatever, things that have numbers and quantifiable in some way. But we're also purveyors of haptic knowledge. We learn by using our bodies and our hands, and somehow we try to balance those two things.
One last thing I would mention about it too, on the necessity, being the mother of all invention. When we look at our pieces, and we're creating our pieces, if something doesn't have to be there, chances are it's not going to be there. When we look at a lot of our pieces, we'll be like, oh, maybe this over here. Maybe we put this little scarf on it. Oh, what about this? What we end up doing is we end up looking at the piece and going, what can we take away without hurting it? Almost in a Zen philosophy, we try to really just look at our pieces and see what we can strip off of it until we sacrifice something. And if we can take something away and it doesn't sacrifice it, why was it there in the first place? And it's not just like a necessity. It doesn't have to be like a peg for somebody to stand on, like it's a function. But sometimes just the aesthetic is the function, or the noise, or many different things can prove to be function. So if something doesn't function, we'll try to just omit it because it really is something that is going to be more subjective at that point. And it's like when people come along with subjectivity, it's like everybody's got a different opinion here. So it's like if you're looking at something that's subjective, you're going to run into more of trouble that way. Whereas if you look at something that is based on fundamentals and facts and something more along the line of math, how do you argue with math? You know, you can't. So it's like when you're putting something together and you're designing it, if your reasons and the reasons you're stipulating are so concrete that they sound like math, you're going to get less people arguing for you, you know, or less people arguing with you because they're not going to be like, well, I'm not sure. They're just going to be like, yeah, you're right. Okay. And that's what you want people to do when you're explaining your idea or trying to sell it to them, you know what I mean? Because as soon as you get them start questioning things, then their thinker's on, and now they're redesigning your piece for you, and that's not what you want to do. You want to be in control of your piece and be determining the outcome of your piece. And in the beginning, there were a lot of times we were like, well, what do you guys think? Now we get all of our information from our clients ahead of time, and one of the unique things that we do with our clients is we will design our pieces for those clients. And if it's for Bill and Sue, it's not the same piece that, you know, Jimmy and Jenny would get. You know, those guys are getting a piece for them, and we do a certain amount of interviewing and process just to learn about them, and we show them different bits of our work, and we kind of entice their inspiration out of them, and they'll be like, I really like that one. That one doesn't do anything for me, but I like that one, and this one's cool. You know, it's like when we walk them through our environment and our work, we get to find out what they like about us. Then we get their story, and then what we do is we use our materials to tell their story. And now what that does is that ensures that we're going to have more of a one-of-a-kind piece. If we're telling a specific story, it's going to be a lot less likely that there's somebody else out there telling that story in another state or another country with the same materials. So we try to use all those uniquenesses to our benefit to make it more of an individual custom piece. And by predetermining all that stuff, we can tell anybody anything. It's like, well, you know how you like the green stuff? That's why this is round and it's gold. And they're just like, all right, I love it. So, you know, there's a little bit of BS in art too, and it's like you got to be able to play it and, you know, get it working your way, hopefully.
We're kind of at the end of our time now, unless there's a pressing short question that seems like we're getting a lot of feedback from our panelists. So perhaps we should end here. I'm not sure that BS was what I was hoping would be the final statement, but why not? And thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you all for coming to our conversation. They can turn them off.